The economy is just now beginning to recover. It's a critical phase, and I think that support would be well placed at this time.
Welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm Heather Long, an economics correspondent at the Post. Today we're talking about the U.S. economy and how quickly it can recover from the worst downturn since the Great Depression. I'm happy to be joined today by Mary C. Daly, the President and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. Let me say just a few words about Mary. She's a key policymaker right now at the Fed, helping to shape trillions of dollars of relief for the economy and markets. She's also a leading expert on jobs and wages. And as if that isn't enough, she's a welder, a podcast host, and one of InStyle magazine's 50 Badass Women Changing the World. Welcome, Mary Daly, to Post Live.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted.
Let's dive right in. Has the recovery started for the United States? And if so, does it look like a V shape?
Well, we've certainly seen some signs that are positive. We've seen people come back to work as we reopened. We've seen retail sales rebound a little bit as people were allowed to go out and shop and spend. And so those are good signs. But I would hesitate to call this a recovery because ultimately the virus will determine the path at which we, or the pace at which we can go. And so a V-shaped recovery is certainly not something that I think is happening. And when I talk to my contacts, I spend a lot of time in the field talking to businesses and community members, and they don't think a V-shaped recovery is here either, largely because the virus is still with us. Without a vaccine or a large-scale mitigation strategy, our top priority is health, and that will determine how sustainably we can stay out and participating in economic life.
You mentioned the path of the virus, and you've been clear that that's going to be key to how this recovery rolls out. Obviously, we've started to see a resurgence in cases, including in California, where you are. Has what you've seen with this resurgence, have you begun to alter your economic forecasts yet?
Well, so the way we forecast right now, at least I do, is I have scenarios. So the good scenario is one where we put these toes in the water, come back out into economic life, and we're able to manage the virus without going back into shelter in place, either regionally or nationally. And I still think it's too early to tell whether that is not happening. It seems like we're putting toes in the water. The virus's cases are going up, as you said, but so far we've been able to handle them. So will that mean that we have to take shelter in place actions again? It's not clear just yet. Now, the other case is one where people sometimes call it a second wave. It could just be that the mitigation we have to take is back to shelter in place, and then the economy we need a longer bridge to get over the virus, and the recovery would be slower. So right now, I still have those two scenarios in mind, and in the next couple of months, we're going to really get a lot more information about what the virus has in store for our economy.
And are you leaning towards one scenario or another at the moment?
You know, right now this is more uncertainty than we have had in living memory, literally. And I don't, if I lean towards one or another, it would be a false confidence, really. It is that we're simply watching to see what happens as we get back into economic life. Can our hospitals handle the cases? Do we feel comfortable with the path we've taken to go back into economic life? If we don't feel comfortable, if the public health officials tell us we need to return to shelter in place or an earlier phase in our strategy, then we're going to need to do that, and that will have economic effects. So it's really right now a wait and watch moment. And the more we can practice our great mitigation strategies, wearing masks, social distancing, the more likely we are to be able to sustain our economic activity.
Let's talk about unemployment. It's on everyone's minds. The current official rate is over 13%. Do you see the U.S. unemployment rate staying above 10% through the end of the year?
That's certainly my projection, and that's under what I call the better case scenario, where we simply come back into economic life more slowly, as we have been gradually, and sometimes we have to go back in a little bit or come out a little bit, but it's really not a V-shaped recovery. And so then would expect that unemployment will remain elevated as workers are coming back, but at a slower pace. And the longer this lasts, as we know, the longer the virus is with us, the more permanent job separations occur. And then those individuals have to make new matches. And employers are right now, the ones I speak to, the CEOs in the 9 Western states, they're really thinking about the pervasive uncertainty and just in a holding pattern. How many people do they need to bring back to meet the basic demand, and but not really ramping up back full output because we still don't know what's going to happen.
Last month, you said that we can't wait 10 years to get back to a full recovery and a good job picture for America. In your best case scenario, how long do you think it could take us to get back to unemployment below 4%, like what we saw in January and February?
Well, again, I know this feels like a stale answer really, but that will depend a lot on the virus. If we can get the public health issues under control, either through a really robust mitigation strategy or a vaccine, then we can re-engage in economic activity really quickly. And I've seen the momentum that consumers and businesses still would like to have if they weren't bridled and weighed down by this virus. So then it could take, just 4 years or 5 years. But if we end up with a pervasive, long lasting hit to the economy, then it could take longer. And when I said it can't take another decade, it really is that we have to commit as a nation, our fiscal agents, the Federal Reserve, all of the businesses, to the virus came. No one is accountable for the virus, but we all have to pitch in and together make this an inclusive economy and one that's growing robustly again.
Given your concerns about getting people back to work, um, I guess I'm wondering, should Congress extend that extra $600 a week unemployment payment after July? Do you think we need extra support?
Well, right now they're debating that, and I won't comment on that specifically. But what I will say is that I think of it this way: if we can back up for a moment or rise up above that specifics for a moment, really all of the support that the CARES Act gave, that Congress gave, the Federal Reserve gave, it's all for one thing: to build a bridge over the worst of the virus and its economic impact, and ensure that people can restart economic activity when the virus is behind us. If we have this scenario where we put toes in the water, people start to get hired back, the economy starts to function again, and we can do that safely, then we can determine how much longer the bridge needs to be. If the other scenario comes to play, in a couple of months we learn that, then we'll have to extend the bridge even longer. So Congress is in the same situation the Federal Reserve is, in my judgment, and that is the virus is going to determine how much more support we need. And right now we're in the data collection work. We're really seeing what happens as states reopen, and we're getting the evidence. And I think in week by week, we're going to get a lot more clarity on that.
I guess from the big picture perspective, given your expertise on the labor market, what do you see as the top 2 or 3 obstacles that are preventing people from getting back to work? Some people do argue that the very generous unemployment benefits may be stalling people getting back to work. Do you see that as part of the top 2 or 3 things?
I know that's offered, and certainly if we have really robust labor demand, then I would think that could be more of a constraining factor. But right now, we don't have robust labor demand. We don't have employers trying to get workers back to work. And in fact, when I speak to the employers, they raise this as an issue that could potentially hold back recovery, but they don't raise it as an issue that is currently holding back the recovery. Right now, it's all about weak labor demand because we have weak consumer demand. And while retail sales and spending have gone up, they're nowhere near the levels they were before the pandemic hit. And so really, we're just not in a robust economy or even a solidly growing economy. And as a consequence, the labor demand is not there. So again, this is simply a bridge. The unemployment benefit is simply a bridge. They're getting people through this. Now, on this point of what are the barriers? I think one of the big barriers is just schools are not in place. School camps are not in place. Summer camps, when I walk around in my neighborhood, parents are worrying, what am I going to do with my children if I'm asked to go back to work? And so there are some real issues about, what are we going to do given that so many aspects of our lives have been disrupted?
Mm. I guess you've made the comment that both the Fed and Congress need to be ready to offer more support or whatever is needed as we go forward. I'm wondering, obviously, Congress is debating should they act again this summer. Based on what you're seeing, do you think another pretty hefty relief package would be wise this summer? Or are you more thinking we should wait and see?
Well, again, I think we're going to know a lot more in the next month, really, because it's so early in our data collection process of how we can deal with the virus as we go back into economic activity. Not every state in the nation. I'm living in a state that hasn't fully opened yet. We still have a variety of our services closed down, and we haven't even gone back into them yet. So as we open those back up and we see if the surge in cases can be controlled, we'll have a lot more information about, as I said, the length of this bridge. If we find that we can do it and that we can do it safely, then we may be able to think about what kinds of supports are needed. But if we find that no, we can't do it safely, we're going to have to go back into shelter in place, businesses will have to shutter again, then more support will be needed. So although it's very uncomfortable, we're in a really uncertain place right now. And I think it's important for us all to accept that uncertainty and collect the information and then be prepared to treat whatever we're given. It's one of these times, I tell my team here, the 1,700 people who work at the Federal Reserve, we need to be thoughtful about what's happening, gradual in our experimentation, and most importantly, flexible, because we are not the masters of this, the virus is.
Um, I want to spend some time on inequality, but one last question on monetary policy. There's been a lot of confusion about why the Federal Reserve has just started buying corporate debt, so the debt of companies like Walmart or Apple or Coca-Cola. Can you explain why is the Fed doing this, and does it help working class Americans?
Yeah, so the way to think about what the Fed has done in terms of offering these facilities, we call them the alphabet soup of facilities, or at least I do. Many people do. So what we've done is we look for pockets of dislocation or breakage in the financial markets, and we go in and we open a facility and treat that. And so one of those pockets was the corporate debt markets. Now, for many, they say, well, wait, how does that help Main Street? Isn't that Wall Street? And the answer I really want people to hear is that Main Street and Wall Street are just interconnected. We all live in one economy. It's an ecosystem. And so if our corporate businesses, and you mentioned a number of them, if they can't get the financing they need, then it's very difficult for them to meet payrolls, to buy the inventories they need to produce products. And so that ecosystem gets it gets unbalanced. It becomes unstable. And so this is a direct way to help those companies by offering corporate debt market relief, but that ultimately helps individuals, workers, and consumers, households in those communities, and that's important. So in that way, us helping the ecosystem of the economy helps everyone.
Hmm. And can I follow up and just get your take? Do you see any reason that the Fed would ever start buying US equities?
Well, one of the things that happens every time we're in a crisis is we go to a broad toolkit that's been used in various sectors or various countries across the globe. And what we've done is we do the same thing. We're always discussing these issues. But if you think back to the toolkit we have, there are many things we would do before we would ever think about doing those types of things. And so we have the funds rate reductions, which we've already taken. We have all of these facilities we opened as a lender of last resort. We have forward guidance, and we have balance sheet policy. And those are very powerful toolkits. If we think of all those tools and we haven't even used them all fully, that's quite a lot of ammunition before we have to think about doing other things that maybe other countries have done. So my way of thinking about this is be curious about everything, but really use the tools are most powerful first.
Thank you. I want to shift to race and inequality. You've been very outspoken on these issues, and there's obviously a huge debate right now in the country about racial injustice. I'm wondering, as an economist, in your mind, what is the best short-term policy to close the racial earnings gap?
Well, it's interesting you say short-term policy. You know, education is the best policy. That's the best way to close the earnings gap. And I think of that as a short-term policy, despite the fact that most people think of it as a long-term policy. So why am I going to make this case? If we get people access to education. Right now, educational attainment is so unequally distributed in our country that there's really no way you can look at those statistics and think that people have equal access. It's just not, it doesn't have face validity, as my friends in epidemiology would say. It doesn't make common sense. So simply equalizing those attainment rates would help us quite a bit. And so if you think, why is that short term? Well, right now we have COVID putting extra burdens on those families who are already struggling to send their first gen kids to college. And so we can do a lot to ensure that they do go, that they complete college, and that they're ready to go when this economy restarts. They can fully engage. And that's really an important way, often overlooked, that we can start mitigating racial inequities, social inequities across the board.
Mm. Um, should the Fed target the Black unemployment rate? As you know, there's a proposal out there, this idea that obviously the Fed's goal is to have maximum employment, so the most Americans possible in jobs. But there's also been a lot of people who've noted that Black workers tend to be some of the last hired, and that Black unemployment rate is often the last to come down as the economy recovers. And so I'm wondering, do you think there's merit to this idea that the Fed should be paying very close attention or even officially targeting the Black unemployment rate?
I think there's tremendous merit to the notion that we need to think about what full employment means. What does it really mean? I am not a fan of a single indicator of any type. I really am a supporter of a dashboard of economic indicators, a dashboard of labor market indicators. And the reason is I've been doing this work for about 25 years, if I'm being truthful, about 25 years. So in 25 years, what I've seen is that the rates that you might pick to target, those dynamics have changed. And so you'd end up picking a rate that wouldn't deliver on full employment. And what we learned in the financial crisis and its aftermath is even when unemployment rates were coming down, and you might have said, wow, that's a lot of progress, wage growth still hadn't come back and earnings gaps were still present. People were still coming into the labor force from all over the country of all different types of workers. And that was what full employment looked like. That's what maximum employment looks like. So I don't want us to be short-sighted, if you will, and pick a single indicator of any type. I'd rather us deal with the complexities of the labor market and recognize that there is a dashboard of indicators and that we have to assess that dashboard each and every time if we're really going to achieve our dual mandate goal of maximum employment and price stability.
Every recession is different and we learn things. Um, we're in early days here, but I'm wondering what long-term scarring are you starting to worry about from this pandemic recession?
That's a really important question because the virus we already knew that there were structural inequities. I mean, the country is becoming greatly aware of this right now, and COVID made them much, much worse. It put a spotlight on them, but it also exacerbated them. And so I'm worried that people who are already struggling to close gaps, be part of the economy, are going to be made much worse by this, and it's just going to be even harder. So the only way around that, whether you're talking about the people who don't have access to education, or you're talking about people who have other struggles, they live in communities where jobs just aren't available, whatever those things are, it really is going to take a national effort for us all to back up and say, how do we create an inclusive economy and stop leaving millions of talented people unoccupied and disconnected to the economy. That's not good for them, and it's not good for their communities, and it's really not good for our nation.
I want to follow up on that. I've seen a lot of headlines floating around that go something like this: as millions of Americans have lost their jobs during this pandemic, billionaires have made a lot of money on the stock market and their investments since we've seen stocks rebound really since a lot of the Fed actions were announced. Um, is the Federal Reserve making income inequality worse or wealth inequality worse right now?
So this is a hard reality that I think is really important for all of us to take in, that you can measure inequalities in a variety of ways. So one measure of inequality is wealth. A second measure of inequality is income. Another measure is wages. Another measure is unemployment or employment gaps. And all of those are different. And importantly, and this is one of the hard things to understand and to really come to grips with, is that when we take actions to stimulate the economy or simply shore it up over the crisis, the stock market, which is quite forward looking, often goes up. But and that increases wealth inequality. But the other types of inequalities are they others don't go up, they don't widen as much as they would have, or they narrow. So in the expansion, for instance, you saw the stock market going up, so wealth inequality rose, but employment inequality, wage inequality, income inequality, they all started to narrow. So how I look at this is that there are systemic inequities in our society, access to opportunity. That opportunity inequality or inequity generates inequalities that play out in wealth and income and the labor market. And what the Federal Reserve is doing right now, and I'm completely supportive of this, we are ensuring that Americans are in the best position to the limits of our powers to re-engage in economic activity when we get past the coronavirus, bridge over this coronavirus. But ultimately, the Fed can't do this alone. We are going to have help from our fiscal agents, from our localities, even from private sector businesses to ensure that all of these Americans get reemployed and reconnected to economic life.
Hmm. Let me come at that a different way. What unintended consequences of the Fed actions are you most worried about, or are you kind of at the top of your mind? Every policy has unintended consequences, but
Absolutely.
yeah, but I guess I'm wondering what's at the top of your list.
The top of my list would be that we settle financial markets, which we very much need to, but then financial markets themselves get a sense that things are better than they really are. And they don't behave in the prudent way that they need to. And so we need to, as while we're doing all of these, making all of these efforts to ensure that we shore up financial markets, we also have to be very mindful of financial excesses and financial stability and how are banks doing and using supervisory powers to ensure that we have a stable financial system that is not just shored up through a crisis, but is actually very robust, resilient for the future shocks we may get as the virus unfolds. So that's top of my mind because, again, Wall Street and Main Street are highly connected. And if there's a financial disturbance, if the financial sector starts to get shaky, which it isn't right now, that hurts every American. And we saw that in the financial crisis. So that's top of mind.
Yeah. Um, you've spoken specifically about commercial real estate, that you're keeping a close eye on that as a good gauge of kind of financial stability and health, especially in your region. Do you think that more is going to be needed for commercial real estate, more aid of some sort?
Well, there, I think that's a sector that's really going to have to think about their business model, right? The pandemic has accelerated a lot of the trends that were already starting. You saw the trend towards maybe we'll have remote work, maybe we won't need as many vehicles, maybe we won't need as much office space. This was all starting to happen. Hoteling, this idea that you can go into an office just one day a week. That was all there, and a fraction of the population, a very small fraction, was using it. And then we have COVID. People go back to shelter in place. And now we have companies around the 12th district saying they may never bring back their workforces to the physical spaces that they were in. And this is going to have a meaningful impact on commercial real estate, on cities that house these big companies. And we're going to have to rethink all of this. So I think one thing that's really important in this period right now is that we begin to think not how do we get the world back to what it looked like before COVID, but how do we in fact pivot and work on the world that's likely to emerge, which is one where there probably will be less of a of a footprint of our companies in our cities and the need for other things other than commercial real estate. So I think those are things cities are just starting to think about, but it's probably beneficial for all of us to start looking at a world that's going to come out of COVID as opposed to thinking about how we manage the world we had before.
Hmm. What's the biggest economic issue that you've changed your mind about or evolved your thinking on in recent years?
That's a great question. And there are so many. If you're really good at this job, you change your mind a lot because you're ultimately evidence based, and so you have a prior. When evidence comes, you use it to change your mind, if you will. But I think the most important thing that I've changed my mind on is, what does full employment mean? What does maximum employment mean? I'm a trained labor economist, and what we learned in school was that, and what I used in my models for years, was that there is a difference between structural unemployment and cyclical unemployment, the kind that we can't do much about because it's related to these long-term factors, and the things that we can do a lot about as a monetary policymaker because we can, stimulate the economy to pull workers in. And it's often taught as a bright line. You can just calculate it and figure out what's structural and what's cyclical. And what I learned in the last expansion, both through the data and the modeling, but also through going out on, we did these Fed Listens tours where we were out in our communities. Really, we are always out in our communities, but we did it very methodically through all the districts in the nation and asked, what does full employment mean to you? What does it mean to run a robust labor market? And what we heard time and time again is that the economy is, if you will, hotter than we think it could be. If unemployment has fallen to historically low levels as opposed to hovering around its pre-recession trend, that this causes employers to rethink the skills they require, to do more on-the-job training. One gentleman even told me that his firm, they were driving into communities, often of color in urban areas. They were a suburban company, driving in, putting them on the equivalent of the Google bus. It wasn't a Google bus, but putting them on the equivalent of the Google bus, driving them back. And he said something really profound to me. He said, these are the loyalist, most interested, most engaged people I've ever hired. And so that, to me, redefines what we mean by full employment. It means that every American who wants a job can get one. Not every American we think could have a job can get one.
Yeah, we all want that world back very soon.
Right.
Following up on that, how low do you believe U.S. unemployment can go now? Do you think it could go under 3%?
Well, I've learned to be humble about what I think on the unemployment rate. And so I won't even try a number. I think what we learned
Okay.
in the last expansion is it can go much lower than we think it can. And that we have to learn, you've probably heard me say this before, we have to learn what full employment is experientially by trying it and seeing, especially with low inflation, than to
Yeah.
guess in advance and try to hit that target.
Well, we only have time for one more question, but I really wanted to get in your thoughts on the need for a 4-year college degree. I think one of the things I've learned from you that surprised me is you really tell young people they need to get that 4-year degree. A 2-year degree is not enough. Is that still what you think?
Yes, and so let me put that in context because I was speaking to someone who has a high school education. He said, "Mary, I'm taking issue with you because I have a high school degree and I'm a plumber and I'm doing well." And I said, "That's fantastic." My push on a 4-year degree is simply this: in our country right now, the demand for college educated workers is rising rapidly, and the college attainment rates have leveled off. There's also considerable inequity across groups, whether you measure them by SES backgrounds, socioeconomic status, by race, by ethnicity, by place in the country, rural areas versus urban areas. And those inequities strike me as not by choice, they're by design. And then the final part of my recipe, if you will, for why college still matters, a 4-year degree, is that right now in our country, we don't have a certification system that works. We don't have people able to go for 1 year. College isn't really even divisible. People can't go for 1 year and get a certificate that employers will recognize or that colleges will even grant and then come back another year. So the system we have today for young people is a 4-year college degree, allows you to earn more, allows you to have greater economic mobility, is the best insurance you have in a downturn against unemployment and income loss, and importantly, earns a better rate of return, according to many studies, than the stock market does. So investing in people, investing in yourself is the best way to do it. While I have an open mind and I'm actually energetic about thinking how to reinvent the educational system, today, I never hear any person from a low income background tell me that they don't want a college degree. It's only people from middle and higher incomes that suggest maybe they don't need one. So until I start hearing it from those communities we serve, then I'm going to stick to my idea that a 4-year college education matters.
Wow. Investing in yourself can be more profitable than investing in the stock market. I'd say that's a note to end on. Thank you, Mary Daly, and thank you to our audience around the world. And please tune in tomorrow at 3:30 p.m. when Washington Post Live will be interviewing Senator Kamala Harris. Thank you.